You're listening to Breaking Biz Dev with John Tyerman and Mark Wainwright. Conversations that break down, beat up, and redefine business development for the professional services firms of tomorrow. And now for your hosts, John and Mark.
Welcome, business developers, to another episode of Breaking Biz Dev. And if you want to learn how to win new business for your practice or professional services firm, you are in the right place. My name is John Tyerman, and as always, I'm joined by Mark Wainwright, where we have a special series of episodes for you this week. But before we get into the main content, please, if you enjoy our podcast, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps grow the show, and we like reading those reviews on the show as well. So leave a rating and a review, and we'll read it for you.
Just to hit on that, those reviews for our podcast, those are fun to read.
Yeah.
Sure, the ratings are great. People see the reviews. We get the 5 stars. That's wonderful. But I just love to read them. I think it's, as all of us do, we love to have others provide completely unsolicited comments on the work we do. And so far, so good. We've got people out there who enjoy what we've done so far. I'm kind of proud of the work we've done so far, John. Not the credit, obviously, is due to your podcast expertise, all the stuff you do behind the scenes. So I think that's been really fun to establish or experience first person. So that's been a ton of fun. So thanks for that. This is a fun gig. So yes, on to our 3-part framework. And the reality is, to call any of this something that I completely invented is maybe a misnomer, but I think that a lot of practitioners, a lot of consultants out there are come across wisdom and rethink and repackage it and maybe refresh it so that they can help others sort of make sense of it all. And I've had the opportunity in the years that I've been doing what I do, in the years that I have been a fractional sales manager for professional services firms, I've had an opportunity to reflect on the work I've done with various firms, all the different puzzle pieces that I help firms assemble when they're trying to build a high functioning sales engine inside their organization. And recently I started to rethink and reframe some of the work that I've done. And there's a 3-part sort of framework that I like to refer to. And I've started to realign my work and my practice around this 3-part framework. And the 3-part framework is create, choreograph, and contract.
Ooh, I like the alliteration.
Yeah. Yeah, the alliteration's intentional. It's probably mostly because I just need something that I can remember. So
Great mnemonic device.
Yeah. So yeah, I would love to touch on each of these areas and kind of give a little background and talk through why I think this maybe repackaging and reframing is helpful and why I enjoy it so much.
All right. Well, yeah, that sounds great, Mark. Let's dig into this. I love the way that you've organized this, and I think our listeners will too, because we've been touching on a lot of different business development topics. But I think the way that you've organized this can help folks who maybe they want to start from the beginning and they want to understand everything in totality. So let's start with your create section, your create part of the framework. Can you give us a 30,000 foot view of that?
Yeah, the use of these terms is intentional. I want to emphasize that. I just didn't kind of come across them. The term or the notion of creating things is familiar to many professional services firms out there, whether it's marketing agencies or engineering firms or architectural firms. We can all kind of envision these things that they create, these wonderful work products that flow from their expertise. But a lot of this creation generally happens after they've won the business, after they've signed the contract. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting if these firms kind of reframed the work they do to take that ability to create and be creative, then shifted that to the stuff that happens before the contract, right? Into this whole marketing and sales world. I think some can picture being creative in marketing, but my spin is that I think you can be you can create inside the world of sales as well. So I think firms can bring the same type of energy to when they're trying to sort of create these new business opportunities. It's a powerful term because creation is a self-made thing. It is, I'm going to make something from nothing, right? And it's also gives you the ability to kind of create your own future. That's one of the powerful senses I get of this word create. It lets us create our own tomorrows. It lets us start to determine where we're headed, right? To identify this big goal we have and start taking the steps in a very intentional, planful way to get there.
You've mentioned this before. I think we were talking about succession planning a few episodes ago.
Yeah.
And Mark, you touched on the point that entrepreneurs don't really hire entrepreneurs, right, within their organizations. But a key part of entrepreneurialism is having that creative mindset and being able to create something. You're creating a business. So I think that there's probably a connection there that maybe we don't need to dive too deep into, but I think that you bring up a really great point about how you can create the business that you want, and you've laid out a number of different steps, and we'll go into a deep dive on creation and how to create the business that you want on the next episode. But this is just a 30,000-foot view.
Yeah. Firms should have some agency in kind of creating their own future, right? They should have some level of control over it. They should be able not just sort of leave it up to fate. And I've witnessed this firsthand on both ends. Firms just seemingly doing the work that comes to them, that kind of ends up in their lap. And sometimes they're happy with it, but sometimes not. But I know there's this need or this desire to be working on things that they care about and they want to focus on, and things that they've sort of envisioned in their future. They can focus on those things. But I think all too often they cede control of that, and firms and individuals just sort of end up working on whatever sort of is on the stack of stuff on their desk, right? So that's not what we want. We want firms to be, and individuals to be, self-determinant. And that's the power of this whole sort of create idea.
Excellent. Let's move on to the next part of your framework that you have, Mark, choreograph. And I'm imagining this dance that's going on. Tell me a little bit more about choreograph.
You just did it right there. You stumbled through it. I did a bad job with this word because it can be a mouthful. Choreography, that one, it's tricky, but I love the notion of it. And one of the reasons I think I love it is because I spent a lot of time watching my daughter as she grew up in her ballet performances. And that's a little sort of heartwarming part of my past that I look at this concept of choreograph, and it brings a lot of good memories. But the dance connection is almost cliche here, right? So it's easy to see how someone would connect this whole idea of dancing with sales, right? Sometimes sales kind of feels like a bit of a dance, right? There's two parties, we're kind of moving together. Maybe we're a little bit out of sync, maybe we're in sync, maybe there's leading, there's this, you could see it, right? You can kind of picture how that would work. And I think a really successful process of leading someone from a maybe to a contract does often feel a little bit like a dance, sometimes in a good way, but sometimes not. But either way, you can kind of apply that. The other part of this whole idea of choreograph that I actually have a little bit more fun kind of playing with is the fact that when we see something like a dance, when we see a dance that is highly choreographed, you never see the hours and hours of planning and preparation and practice that go into that, right? You have to know that these people who are professionals at this have spent endless amounts of time just getting it right. We never see that. All we see is this final sort of show, right? And it looks amazing, right? It is flawless. It is seamless. It is artistic. It flows. And we never see any of the mistakes and the improvement and everything else. That's kind of the stuff that's going on behind the scenes. So this whole choreograph thing, whenever we see something that's tightly choreographed, it is planned down to each second of the performance, but it looks like it's done with a powerful sense of ease and grace, right? So I thought, oh, wouldn't that be cool if we looked at something as difficult and complex as sales, all that pre-contract work, as something that just flowed, something that had a sense of ease and calmness and something that was actually enjoyable. Wouldn't it be cool if we could actually not just build a process, but also sort of embrace this sort of approach that says, this is something that's hard. It takes a lot of practice, but hopefully if I get it right, the people that I, do this with, walk through a sales process with, find it enjoyable, find that it flows, find that it moves with its own sense of ease and grace, right? Wouldn't that be great? And I think it's entirely possible. So that's this whole sort of notion of choreograph, the obvious sort of cliche almost thing of the dance, but also this thing that moves with this ease and grace, but there's so much going on behind the scenes that sometimes people that are in the process don't even see. So that's a cool aspect of it.
Yeah, I like this because especially in professional services, business development is naturally just decentralized across the organization, right? So you've got doer-sellers who it's their responsibility to fulfill on the work, but it's also part of their responsibility to sell the work, right? Yeah. And so this choreograph, you brought up a point a few times, Mark, that because you're in sales, you have a responsibility to lead the prospects through this process. You've had more reps at the process. You're more familiar with it. But I think choreograph kind of takes it a step further to your point of not only just understanding the process and moving through it, but having the confidence to be able to lead and then leaning on things like cognitive biases, which we've talked about in the past, and understanding that to help give you that confidence to move. Because dancing in choreography, it's sure there's a lot of practice and there's a lot of movement and that goes into it, but there's still an art form to it. Right. And there's still like that has to come naturally and, like you say, effortlessly. So I like that section as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that, and I think I've seen it in people that I work with and people that I coach. Initially, when we engage, there's probably no process, so it looks very, whatever they're doing has some flow to it, likely very disorganized, but it's not in some sort of 1, 2, 3 ABC sort of process. Then when they first start to learn it, they start to perceive that as something rigid and restrictive and that's a process. I need this. I need my interactions with these potential clients to be more fluid, more easygoing. But I'm the guy saying, yeah, okay, that comes later. That comes later once we've learned the process. So we first start and it's lacking process, lacking structure, but probably an easy conversation, but they're not getting the results they want. Then we bring a kind of a more formal structure to it. People get a little uncomfortable until they start to learn it and understand it. And then out the other end of it, right, the final product hopefully is something that has all that structure and that framework and that process, but looks, conversational and easy and not pushy and not salesy. So there's clearly a kind of a 3-part transition where people love the easygoing beginning, but there's no structure and there's no results. Then they work through it and they come out the other end, hopefully having it be a process they're comfortable with and confident with, like you said. So, yeah.
Yeah, the dance analogy is great. I'm a musician, a part-time musician myself. And so I see a lot of similarities between like learning songs with your bandmates, and it sounds clunky at first, but then you practice it a few times and then, it gets better and better. And then you stop thinking about time signatures and melodies and you just go out and you deliver on it, and it's masterful. So
yeah, great.
So let's talk about your the third part of this 3-part framework, contract.
It could also be called close, but we steer clear of those sort of salesy terms. I'm not wedded to.
You don't want to withhold coffee from anyone, right? Because coffee's for closers.
Right. Yeah. Always be closing. All those terrible sort of salesy analogies. They're just they're lousy. So let's call it contract, really, because with professional services firms, this whole process, this whole dance ends up at a point where there's some kind of an agreement, some sort of a contract. So again, at this point, firms approach these final critical moments in this whole dance, the final contracting points where we're presenting pricing, negotiating, and then finalizing contracts. They approach it way too casually or way too systematically, right? They're not reacting to the situation well enough. They're pricing the work and not the client, which is something that we've talked about in the past, others have talked about. And they find themselves in this same sort of hamster wheel again and again of working their fingers to the bone, trying to come up with the magic price, right, on their spreadsheet or whatever else, throwing it at the prospective client. The client says, that's too much, sharpen your pencil. And then they go back and they're like, all right, so we have to give this whole thing a 15% haircut. And they come back with a lower price, but basically the same work. So, margin takes a hit, and they do that again and again and again. So this final act in this whole process is critical. Pricing needs to change in most professional services firms. They need to adopt more contemporary, more progressive pricing approaches. Negotiation needs to change. Negotiation is not always, it's too much, go sharpen your pencil, right? Negotiation needs to be a win-win situation. Contracts need to change. There's so much conceded inside your standard agreements, like payment terms and use of technology or indemnification and all these different little clauses that hide inside these big legalese agreements that concede so much. And when I talk about conceding things, it's usually associated with just with risk. And it's not risk from a liability standpoint, but it's just risk from both parties in any situation have some level of risk to tolerate. Consultants take on some risk when they take on a new client. They're like, well, we don't know if we're going to get paid or if this client's going to be good to work with. Yeah. Prospective clients, they take on risk because they're thinking, we're going to pay all this money and we, better get what we're paid for, or whatever else, or it's going to be late, or the costs are going to balloon, or whatever else. So both parties take on some risk. So there's a wonderful opportunity inside of this whole sort of contract thing to address risk, to create win-win situations, and for both parties to kind of really be happy about it. And I don't think that most folks look at contracting as sort of a win-win, everybody's happy situation. Most folks look at it as sort of a zero sum where somebody's got to lose in order for somebody else to win.
Yeah, these agreements are mutually beneficial and they're mutually valuable. So it makes sense to call attention to that and to structure these contracts in a way and highlight the fact that we're contracting for a reason. There is a mutual exchange of value. It doesn't need to be a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So what are some of you've got some details that you want to tease at for some of these different sections of your framework that we're going to dive into in depth in the next few episodes. So what will folks that are listening right now, what can they expect to learn from a deep dive into each one of these sections?
Well, the first one is create, right? And we emphasize that whole point of making something from nothing, right? Being the self-determinate person inside of a professional services firm that's doing the work you want to do, building the relationships you want to build, et cetera. We used an analogy previously when we talked about prospecting, or I know we'll dig into our little library of episodes John will come up with, but the analogy was around the iceberg analogy. So we'll talk about that in the world of create. And the iceberg analogy is simply that there's only a small portion or percentage of the iceberg that's floating in the Arctic Ocean that's visible to the eye, right? It's above the waterline. The vast majority of the iceberg is under the waterline. And when we talk about creating new opportunities, we're typically talking about the stuff that's underneath the waterline, because the stuff that's above the waterline are organizations or potential clients that are, in an active buying situation. So they're looking for someone to help them with their problem or fulfill a need, or heck, go, hire a vendor, which is a pretty lousy term in the professional services world.
And you don't want to be a vendor.
No, you don't want to be a vendor. You don't want to be a check the checkbox vendor. So creation, I would say for the most part, we're going to really focus on that 90% or more sometimes of all those potential clients that are below the waterline. So it takes a little bit of work, right? So it's not someone coming to your front door knocking, it's you going and creating. So that's the analogy that we'll use to kind of help us through this whole create idea.
Let's talk about your choreograph part. So what are some things that listeners can come to expect when we do a deep dive into the choreograph?
So choreograph is all about bringing this process and organization to something that hopefully in the eyes of your prospective clients seems fluid, and seamless and effortless. And I've talked for a while about underlaying a fairly standard approach to a multi-step sales process. And this is not different from what others would experience. The importance of initial qualification being the first step, making sure there's a good fit. The importance of extensive discovery and thorough discovery that yields a really deep understanding of your client, their needs, their challenges, all those things. Proposals, tiered proposals, 3-option proposals, and focusing on contemporary ways to price. And then lastly, like we talked about, negotiation, how to work our way through a win-win situation when it gets to negotiation. So that's that's a fairly standard sort of sales process sort of methodology, the steps that walk through there. Sure. There's other things that I'd like to weave throughout choreography that I think are worth highlighting, because when I thought through choreography, I thought, well, okay, we've got our steps, we've got our sales process, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever our sales process is. But then there's these interesting sort of threads that walk through the entire process, or you can see it through the entire process. Mm-hmm. And I've got kind of a list of them here, and I'll just kind of run through them.
Sure.
The first is curiosity and inquiry, maintaining a good, healthy sense of curiosity and inquiry throughout the entire process. The second one is a low level of self-orientation. And this kind of references the trust equation from Charlie Green and the Trusted Advisor. And we'll talk a little bit about that. This low self-orientation goes sort of hand in glove with that curiosity and inquiry thing. It's being oriented on others. The third one I have here is focusing on results, not focusing on deliverables or hours or any of that stuff, but focusing on results. Really clearly identifying where we need to go together. When from a professional services firm, this is critical, because everything we need to do in the early sales process and when we're delivering the work needs to be focused on helping the client achieve their results, right? It's not the deliverable 1, deliverable 2 milestone. Of course, those are steps in the process, but we need to be focused on results.
Yeah.
For any number of reasons. The next one I have there is synchronous conversations. And synchronous conversations is this whole idea that, look, throughout this entire dance, right, from the beginning to the end, we need to be in synchronous conversations, whether they're virtual conversations or in person, telephone conversations, whatever it is. We need to, and we can't let off on that. We can't think, oh, this thing that really should be a conversation we can just take care of through email. Never works. Doesn't work. Always synchronous conversations. The next one I have is mirroring and reflecting. And mirroring and reflecting are sort of two very closely related terms. Mirroring is in these synchronous conversations, we're able to connect with people. We're able to mirror language, tone, tempo, body language, all those things that make us more relatable and help our component to developing trust. And then reflecting is both in the moment and later on. We're constantly reflecting and confirming and reconfirming what we've come to understand. So you asked me a question. Did I hear you right? Can you ask that question again? Let me clarify your response. And then afterwards, when we're following up after our conversations, that we're doing a really good job of reflecting back what we heard, what we understood, right? That's a critical component that happens throughout the entire process. The next one I have here is related to some others. It's seeking and building understanding. From the very beginning all the way through, we have to constantly be seeking to gain a deep understanding. And that builds over time from our very first conversation to right as we're kind of finalizing our proposals. And we're constantly referencing back to that understanding. Okay, so we've developed this deep understanding of your organization. And I use this constantly in everything I do in these sort of sales processes. And it's so critical. The next one is seeking and gaining permission. This is another tool that you can use throughout this entire process. Hey, let's find a time for us to get together next week. Tuesday afternoon works well for me. Can I send you an invitation for a meeting then? We've got this piece of information I can share with you. Is it okay if I send that? So we're always seeking and gaining permission to move forward. We're always getting others to buy into and opt into this whole process. We're never assuming something's okay. People are all right with it. Always seeking, gaining permission. And then the last one, I've got a bunch of stuff sort of listed under this one. I probably could break it out, but this one's guiding, confirming, advancing, and connecting. Guiding is all about understanding your role in this whole process, that you need to be a good guide.
Right.
Confirming is like a backstop. It's always confirming the process that you've made to date, everything you've accomplished together to date, and then moving forward from there. It's never letting things slide backwards or stall, or that's confirming. Advancing is always designing a process where you have a very clear next move, next step. Whether it's small or big or whatever it is, that's advancing. We always want to keep things moving forwards, because movement in this whole process is critical. We always want to keep things, otherwise it just stalls, right? It's like anything else. It's just, we want a nice momentum. And the last one, connecting. Connecting is all about kind of creating a chain of activities and interactions and events that are all linked from the beginning to the end. And anytime that chain or that connection of activities breaks, it leads to confusion and ambiguity. So in the sales process, we want to always make sure that we're connecting activities one to another. So that's a long list right there of a bunch of things, a bunch of elements, I think, that are kind of part of this whole world of choreography that make it seem seamless and pleasant and enjoyable and focused on others, and just a nice series of interaction and conversations that lead to one another.
I have so many questions and about all of this. I am really excited to dig into this one because I'm more of a process-oriented person myself.
Yeah.
And I see how there's some gaps in my own sales process that I could probably learn from. Yeah, that's going to be a fun one to unpack. All right, the last one, contract. So what are some of the things that we'll be doing a deep dive into under the contract part of your framework?
Yeah, a good bit of this, things we've referenced or maybe talked in depth about.
Yeah.
Obviously, contemporary approaches to pricing, tiered pricing, 3-option pricing, that's an important component of this. And we can reference some of the other material that we've developed around it. But we'll touch on that because it's worth digging into. The other thing is this whole world of cognitive bias and how that influences us one way or another when we're trying to make informed decisions. We can go deeper. We can bring up different cognitive biases that we've come across or that we're exploring and leveraging. It's worth restating again and again, John. I recognize and understand and leverage cognitive bias in every single sales conversation that I'm in, every single one, right? And whether people recognize it or not, these things are happening in every single conversation. So the fact that I am aware of them and leverage them in a good way to benefit myself and my prospective clients is super powerful. So that's another part of it. We haven't talked a ton about negotiation, that it needs to be a win-win and it can't be a zero-sum game. So we will talk about that. And what I think I'd like to do a little bit in this whole contract phase is we can pull apart some contracts. I mean, I have enough contracts that I've developed or other people have developed. I know you've got some as well. So we can look at some contracts and kind of tease out some of those crazy legalese clauses in there that are wonderful items for negotiation. Or we can just bring up other elements that we can use inside of a negotiation conversation. Negotiation's a good thing. I think most fear it. Most people are sort of conflict averse, but I think negotiation is really good. One of the most powerful elements of negotiation is negotiation can be, whether you're having it or not, or how successful it is, can be a leading indicator that you need to change your contracts or you need to change your pricing or whatever else. If you're never ever negotiating contracts, that's a bad sign.
Yeah.
That says, oh yeah, they priced this thing super low and we're totally happy with it. We're not going to negotiate at all because they might actually bump it up. So that's important. I negotiate my contracts most, and not 100%, but most. And a lot of times it has to do with little nitty gritty things here and there, but negotiation is just that one final moment in this whole process where everybody comes together and says, oh, this is going to be great. Because if you don't negotiate and there's stuff left out of the conversation and there's things that are missed, problems can arise in the future. So there you go. That's contract.
Yeah, I like that you bring up negotiation as an area of the sales process that can kind of illuminate different aspects of your contract and what you can tweak to improve. And maybe it's your price, maybe it's the terms that you set, things like that. And I think it's great to be able to recognize those patterns and look at your past contracts, look at your past opportunities, why you won, why you didn't win, and understand what were some things that you conceded in during those negotiations, and revisiting all of that, because that is so important to go back and look at what you did well, what you didn't, and how you can improve.
Agreed.
Excellent. Well, Mark, I'm excited to dig into each of these 3 areas of your framework. And for folks that are listening, it's going to be a wild ride. I think they're going to get a lot of great information out of it.
Good. I think a lot of people look at a process, maybe even the sales process, as something linear. I think this lends itself really well to being more of a cycle where there's creations happening, choreography, contracting, and then that builds on itself. So it's from my perspective, it's definitely a cyclical framework and a cyclical process. So yeah, I'm excited to dig into it next time. All right, John, I think that's it for today. Until next time.
Until next time, Mark.
Thanks for listening to Breaking Biz Dev. Subscribe on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, or listen to the show at breakingbizdev.com. This episode was produced by Red Cedar Marketing. If you think a business podcast is right for your company, visit redcedarmarketing.com to learn more.